turn left. 30 years ago this month, the video game landscape will be forever changed by a newcomer to the console world. Let's take a look at the release of the Sony PlayStation. Prior to the release of the PlayStation in 1994, Sony had accrued a little bit of experience in the video game industry. One of their first big ventures was becoming a publisher for NES games starting in 1989. Under the Sony ImageSoft brand, they would publish many games on the NES and Super NES before branching off to Sega. And one of their first published games on the Sega CD? Sewer Shark.
Don't you love the smell of the sewers in the morning?
Baby steps, people. Baby steps. The father of the PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, had been with Sony since graduating from college in the late 70s, working mostly as an engineer at first. He grew a fascination with video games in the 80s and pursued for the executives at Sony to enter the video game market, but unfortunately was turned down. Ken Kutaragi would seal a deal with Nintendo to help design and manufacture the sound chip for the Super Nintendo. Ken had finally gotten that foot inside the video game industry door, and in the process, got to work in conjunction with the most popular game company on the planet. But the sound chip and its use had some fine print attached to it that Nintendo, they were just not very fond of. It could only be used if developers bought proprietary toolkits to work with it straight from Sony. Nintendo was not happy about this. The company saw this as an attempt by Ken and Sony overall to not only profit heavily from this, but it was part of a larger plan for Sony to gain more leverage, possibly giving Sony more insight into entering the market on their own. Yet for some reason, the two got into talks and eventually an agreement of some sort to co-develop a CD system for the Super NES was set into motion. You have to remember that Nintendo had seen some of the success of the NES Disk System add-on that was very popular in Japan, so a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo was seen as something ultimately beneficial to Nintendo, as the industry slowly started to focus more and more on what the new medium could do for gaming. I would get into the whole Nintendo-Sony merger announcement, but you know what? At this point, it has been talked about to death on forums, video game sites, other YouTube videos, and nitpicked for decades. So I'm not going to get into that. Regardless of who is to blame, it is the fallout that matters. And Ken Kutaragi was furious. And he would push Sony executives to try and go at it alone in creating a CD-based console. But once again, he would be turned down. Sony then approached Sega in the hopes of striking some sort of a deal with them, but they were already deep in the research and development of the Mega CD drive. So when the PlayStation was released in Japan in December of 1994, it was not only a monumental step for Sony, but gamers as well. We just didn't know it back then. For those that might not remember, during this time in the early 1990s, the market was saturated with tons of consoles being released, with the majority of them trying to take advantage of the CD medium in some way, shape, or form. So when it came to announce its release here in the US, Sony did not forget Sega. $2.99. So, why is it that the PlayStation got it right and persevered where many others had failed? What is it that Sony did differently? Now, I have a few ideas on why it succeeded. First was the failed merger. Yep, you heard me right. This actually helped out Sony. When it launched, they had already gotten plenty of coverage, not only because it was a Sony-made console, but because of its ties to Nintendo and that merger. The fallout between both companies actually helped Sony in the long run. The media ate it up, and Sony was seen as the victim of this broken merger. And on top of that, the very little information on the failed Nintendo PlayStation had left many gamers wondering what could have been. The gaming media was salivating at the story angle, and the possibilities of what could come of all this was enough to take center stage across many video game magazines of that time. This created hype and helped Sony heavily market a product that was still under development. And that brings me to my second point: time. Or better yet, timing. The failed merger allowed Sony to sit back and recollect themselves. There is no doubt that during that time, Sony took plenty of notes as company after company stepped up to the plate and failed in marketing a proper CD-based system. Now, why is that? Well, they were focusing on the wrong technology, FMV. The majority of games heavily emphasized full motion video in one way or another, but video technology and compression methods were still crude for the time. And all they did was take away from the gaming experience, opting for visual appeal above it all. Sony decided at one point in the development process that 3D would be the PlayStation's main goal in delivering an optimal gaming experience, and its architecture will be built around that concept. FMV will be part of the experience, but only to complement the 3D features. By the time it was released at the end of 1994, the market had slowly withered down to a very select few consoles. With less systems to take up shelf space, the PlayStation had a better chance of being able to launch to market with little competition. Most importantly, Nintendo had no CD-based system on the market, and their only hints of entering the 32-bit console generation was rumors of a merger with SGI in creating a concept known then as Project Reality. It would be almost 2 years before Nintendo would enter the market once again. Sega fumbling towards the end of the 16-bit generation and how they screwed up the launch of the Sega Saturn outside of Japan also helped out Sony in breaking into the market as the new kid on the block. When it launched here in the US in 1995, those same kids that had been around 7 to 10 years old back in 85 or 86, well, now they were a little bit older, they were almost young adults. Nintendo had opened the eyes of gamers like never before, while Sega helped in reshaping the gaming culture slightly during their very successful marketing run in the 16-bit era. By 95, those same kids now had jobs, they had purchasing power. Sony marketing pushed the idea that video games were no longer a child's hobby, but rather just a hobby, and a fun one at that, being able to be enjoyed by kids and adults. Timing was everything. Games are the blood and lifeline of any system, and the PlayStation would benefit from Sega's marketing woes and Nintendo's absence from the 32-bit era in those early days. Namco, being a huge rival to Sega on the arcade side, would back the PlayStation from day one, offering games like Ridge Racer, Air Combat, and Tekken in the very early days, helping it ease its way into the video game market. With a developer like Namco behind them, it only eased doubts in the mind of gamers everywhere. I remember seeing many pictures of games that will be coming for the console on magazines like EGM and GamePro and thinking that if a company could pull it off, it could be Sony. But what really blew me away was walking into a Funko Land and seeing two kiosks with both the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. The Saturn had Virtua Fighter and the PlayStation had Battle Arena Toshinden on display. Both side by side so gamers could compare right there. To me, at that time, mind you, Battle Arena Toshinden looked and played much better and faster than Virtua Fighter. For some reason or another, I could never get into Virtua Fighter. I don't know why. The PlayStation was now on my radar. Well, Dad and my friend had bought a Sega Saturn with Virtua Fighter and Daytona USA on day one, so that made my decision a little bit easier. However, I would not get a PlayStation for another 2 years. In the meantime, the PS1 started to attract many developers and many great titles would be released by mid to late 1997. This is where the PlayStation really started to cement itself as a true contender. Groundbreaking titles and even new franchises would find a home on the PlayStation. Gamers saw game companies that have been staples in the Nintendo systems now popping up on this new console. Capcom, Konami, Square, Bandai, to name some of the big ones, and yes, as I mentioned previously, Namco. Now don't get me wrong, this wasn't a first time thing either, as the Genesis and TurboGrafx had gotten plenty of support from such companies during the 16-bit era. But Sony now had almost full support across the board. Franchises that many grew up with on the Nintendo and Super Nintendo were suddenly being announced for the new console. Mega Man, Mega Man X, Final Fantasy VII, which I will get into more in a little bit, Metal Gear Solid, Dragon Quest, Castlevania, Street Fighter, Contra, Blaster Master. Hey, you know what? I didn't say they were all going to be great, okay? Now, it also helped that some of these titles were exclusive to the PlayStation. You wanted to play Final Fantasy VII? You needed to get a PlayStation. Final Fantasy VII in particular was a groundbreaking title in many ways. It had been in stages of production and planning for quite some time, including during the time of the Super Nintendo and even the Nintendo 64. Yet Sony, with the CD medium, managed to convince Square to move production to the PlayStation. Now this alone was a big deal. Snatching the rights to getting a title like Final Fantasy VII on your console alone was enough to celebrate. Taking the title away from Nintendo, however, now that was eye-opening. The decision to exclude the CD medium would come to bite Nintendo in the ass, and Final Fantasy VII left a huge chew mark. It not only changed the Final Fantasy franchise, heralding a new course of artistic and overall presentation design, but the massive marketing campaign that saw the game being showcased in magazines, TV commercials, and even partnering with Pepsi meant that not only did the game get exposure, but the PlayStation as well. Sales in 1997 for the PlayStation peaked. No doubt that the hype behind Final Fantasy VII plus the actual game actually, being worth the hype, helped in boosting interest in the console. This point right here in time in gaming history, I feel, is where gaming changed as a whole. If you had been on the sidelines wondering if you should get a PlayStation, this game was a good reason to get one. If you did, then you were jumping into the ring at the perfect time. New genre franchises like Resident Evil, Oddworld, Apes Odyssey, Tomb Raider were available, as well as many fun titles like Cool Borders, Twisted Metal, NFL Game Day, Colony Wars, Crash Bandicoot, and tons of many more games sprawled across many different genres. On top of that, you had amazing titles like Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil 2, Street Fighter Alpha 3, Suikoden 2, Tenchu and Ridge Racer 4, and Silent Hill was on the way as well. So not only did you have a plethora of games to choose from, but PlayStation had opened the floodgates for the JRPG market. And if you were a fan of this genre, this right here was the system for you. So from what you can see, Sony made all the right moves at the right time. The merger helped in giving Sony not only insight into the industry that they were so desperately trying to enter, but it gave it time to gauge that same industry and make better decisions based on the failures of all the consoles that had been released before. Sega's troubles with their inner disputes as to which way to approach the 32-bit market left many of its fans confused and jaded. Add to the fact that Nintendo was once again delaying its entry to the next console generation left Sony with the perfect window of opportunity. The exclusion of a CD drive by Nintendo also meant that developers would abandon most of their support for the CD-based PlayStation and Sega Saturn. That same generation that had grown with the Nintendo and Master System were now young adults, and the PlayStation was the console aimed at this demographic, delivering titles tailor-made for this older audience while at the same time porting over some well-beloved known titles to the 32-bit era. Let's not forget that they also revolutionized the way controllers will be designed when they created the dual analog controller in 1997. I still recall renting Ape Escape from Blockbuster since it was one of the first few titles to be fully compatible with this new controller, and right away, it felt like a game changer. Sony at this point could do no wrong. They were the new Nintendo. Unlike them though, they have yet to stumble big time and presently still sit on top of the gaming mountain as of 2024.
All right, Morty, go. Talk about the thing. They paid us a lot.
Okay, yeah, this is the PlayStation 5. It's really fast.
Yeah, they really wanted you to mention the speed. That was really important to them.
Yeah, it's super fast. Like, way less of those long loading screens, you know?
Why don't you tell them the thing about the buttons?
Huh? Oh, the controller has haptic feedback vibrations that simulate in-game actions. The L2 and R2 buttons have adaptive resistance.
Morty, don't block the console. They wanted that in the shot.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, I am well aware that the Switch has outsold the PS5 by 81 million units. However, I still can't justify buying a PS5, but you know what, that is a conversation for another day. What PlayStation console do you have the fondest memories with? Which one disappointed you the most? Share with us all, and until next time, keep watching and keep gaming. I still can't justify buying a PS5, but you know what? That is a conversation for another day.